introduce today's presenter. Joy Beatty is Vice President of C-Labs, and that is C-Level's research and development arm. She's been in the business analysis field for over 10 years and has received both her CBAP certification and the new PMI PBA certification. Joy implements new methodologies and best practices that improve requirements elicitation and modeling. She's also actively involved as a leader in the requirements community. Joy is part of the core team that developed the most recent version of IIBA's Business Analysis Body of Knowledge, or BABOK, as well as PMI's Business Analysis for Practitioners, a practice guide. Joy has also co-authored 2 books, Visual Models for Software Requirements, co-authored with C-Level CEO Anthony Chen, and Software Requirements 3rd edition with Carl Wiegers. Finally, Joy is a contributing author on PMI's Foundational Standard for Business Analysis. And with that, I'll pass it along to Joy to walk us through what we'll be covering in today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Simon. Appreciate the introduction, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever part of the world you're in. Here's a quick look at what we're going to cover here today in the session. So the thing I'm going to start with is really about how do I understand what the right projects are to do, and then once I know what the right projects are, how do I know what features to prioritize within those projects? Then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about metrics, and specifically what metrics can you use to identify ROI in your organization, and then even some tips about how to start measuring those. And then we'll wrap up with a few things that I feel like you could take away and start using tomorrow on your projects, no matter where you are in the life cycle of your projects. You know, a long time ago, way back, say 5 years ago, we used to talk about how to get your projects done on time. We discussed a method where you had to cut as much of your project as possible, just really to try and hit some kind of a deadline. I can remember a project that we worked on, this is like 12 years ago, where there was a particular business return that they were looking for. It was a multi-million-dollar return. However, the functionality had to be implemented by a particular deadline. And if that deadline was missed, there would literally be $0 return over the next year. All of our stakeholders were set on a particular scope in this project, and so looking at it was pretty clear they're not going to hit it. But back then that was the only thing. Do we hit it on time or do we not hit it on time? And so things started to shift. It's not just about a deadline anymore. It's more like, how do I get the actual value in the hands of the customers? We'll revisit that example later in the presentation. Now, fast forward to today, the world is a little bit different, I think. Maybe 5 years ago we cared about how do we get things done on time. But today, we don't just care about that. We still care about that, but we care about more. Now we have to do the same thing, but with a lot less money. There's some interesting studies out there. In particular, CIO magazine did a recent study that demonstrated that CIOs, it was like 70% of CIOs are actually finding that their new project spend is getting cut anywhere from 50 up to even 100%. Our experience when working with our customers is that we are absolutely seeing budgets cut in the IT space, maybe not as dramatically. I mean, it could be 20-30%, maybe on the order of about 50%. But the point is, when we deliver, particularly in IT organizations, it's not just get the thing done on time, get it done with a whole lot less money. So that means we've got to figure out how do we do that. I like this little cartoon. It's a little gruesome in a sense, but I think it gets the point across. With the dire state of budgets today, we're talking about cutting as many non-essential features as we possibly can. We are literally cutting projects down to the bone. So, for example, we had 2 projects that we worked with from one customer. They were about to start. Both of them, they estimated about a $1 million cost on these 2 projects. One project had a return of a $20 million, and the other one was $4 million. Now, both of those are really good positive returns, right? One is much bigger than the other, but even with a $4 million return after spending $1 million, that's awesome. So what do you do? Do you do one of them or do you do both of them? In this particular case, we suggest to our customer that you actually only do that $20 million project. The reason for that is because we want to reduce the risks of them both failing, and so by taking on 2 pretty significant projects, they're high risk that neither one would succeed. Whereas if we took all the resources available and really allocated them to the larger return project, better chance it would succeed. And then if it got done, and it got done faster ideally, then you could come back and pick up the second project along the way. So that's the kind of concepts that we're talking about today. Now, the Standish Group is, they put out a study, it's called the Chaos Report, and they update it every few years. And I found that there's one particular metric I think that is really fascinating. It's that 65% of features are rarely or never used. So when you think about software, what I'm saying is all the different features that are in it, 65% of them rarely or never get used, right? That's huge. And so wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to cut 65% of those features, right? That's the key to how we actually can turn what are often failing projects into some kind of success. Now, you might be skeptical when I say 65% of features can be cut. So I want to show you a really quick example. I recently did this. I opened up the email application and I started just a new blank email. And I picked, within 30 seconds, I was able to pick 3 different things that I found completely useless or I didn't even know they existed. And I look at this screen, the new email screen, I look at it every day, hundreds of times a day, right? And yet, within 30 seconds, I could come up with, and you'll see them here circled on the screen. These are features that, yeah, I mean, when I now look at them, okay, that could be interesting, but I mean, really, like the one in the middle, how often do you actually just go to draw an email or draw a picture in your email? You don't. You would more likely open up like a paint or an art program of some sort or screenshot somewhere. So anyway, again, this is just a demonstration that this is true in software we use every single day. I think the same is true if you were to open up Excel or you're opening up PowerPoint. Or a classic one is, imagine picking up your phone for a minute, flip through how many applications do you have installed and how many do you actually use. We carry a lot of fluff around in our lives in terms of feature sets that we don't really need. And I'm not saying no one ever uses them, I'm just saying not necessarily enough to justify the expense of having built the feature. So with that, what I would say we're up against here, the problem. We can't build everything. With the way that IT budgets are cut and the pressure to deliver things to market faster, we can't build it all. But the good news, I don't think we need to build it all, right? There's lots of features that just aren't all that important. And so the solution that I'll propose is that we need to figure out how do we make choices about what to build or what not to build based on the expected outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So one idea is that we can use these business outcomes and we can focus that scope of work that we're doing around that space. So first, we're going to use our business outcomes to determine which projects we should even take on, right? So if the value isn't there, cut the project. So literally, if you're thinking about planning for the next fiscal year or even the next quarter, just depending on what level in the organization you are, maybe you're part of a portfolio team, really try to understand what are the different outcomes that the projects, the possible projects are striving for, and then figure out which ones are going to be most valuable. There's some other factors there too, considering risks and costs and things like that. But ultimately, what's that outcome? If it's a small outcome, good chance we don't need to do it. Now, once we've selected which projects we're going to perform, then we can look within the projects individually. So we know what the business outcome was, right? In theory, we defined it to even select it as a project to take on. If not, we would need to go understand those right away. And then we're going to use those outcomes again. This time we're going to determine what features are in scope or what features are out of scope, right? So the business outcomes are the most important factor to consider when making those scope decisions. Right? It's not someone's gut feeling or someone's personal desires, but really the actual value that's going to be delivered from a given feature. And we'll see in a moment that there's some techniques we can use to actually quantify the value of requirements. We can cut things that don't add sufficient benefit. Now, both of these things you'll notice are cyclic. Right, so you are constantly reassessing which projects to start or even cancel midway. Like that's a real option on the table. If you've invested even $1 million and you're like, wow, we are not going to get any kind of return, you're better to cut your losses sooner, right? But the point is you're always reevaluating that. And then clearly within a project, again, we're always going to be prioritizing that scope within projects. And this is interesting because I think that agile development methods have brought this technique to the forefront of project teams' minds, right? So they're constantly having to reprioritize the backlog and make sure they're working on the most important thing all the time. So this, what I'm using here is to say, make those decisions based on the business outcomes, right? That is such a key technique to use in that process. And by the way, if you're in a place in your career where you can actually recommend that projects get canceled, using real data, not your intuition, not a gut feel, you're using real data to do it, right? That's huge. That's you making a huge impact in your own organization. So let's dive into a technique about how can we quantify that business value, right? So some of you may be familiar with the term business outcome that I keep throwing around, but I want to talk about what it actually means. And one definition of business outcomes that some of you may have heard of is maybe something that's specific and measurable results. They're clearly recognized by senior executives as beneficial to the organization or to the enterprise, right? So that's one kind of way to think about it. But I've summarized that down into a few words here on the screen, right? At the end of the day, we're talking about what are the business benefits that an organization expects to receive, right? Now, right out of that, you're going to see the words increase revenue or cut costs. So I think that's really key here, that for the most part, in most organizations, the true business outcomes are related to either growing revenue or trimming costs. And it's a rare case that you will find a project that doesn't do one of those two things. And if it doesn't, you need to seriously question, why are we doing this project, right? So I feel like I get a lot of pushback on that around organizations maybe who are in the compliance space, where they have to do a project so that they're compliant with some particular standard. Or it could be a government standard, it could be an organizational standard, whatever it may be. The thing I will say about that is that you care about doing that compliance for a reason. We just need to understand what that reason is. And usually it's because they don't want to get fined, or they don't want to end up in jail. They don't want to be put out of business. All three of those things are very, very expensive, right? So I've related those back to money pretty easily when I dig under, why does the standard matter? Why do I care about the compliance? Okay, so again, value can be measured through these business outcomes. And I think, I've put a kind of a simple example in here. These are going to look so different from organization to organization. The examples here are from what we are calling a chemical tracking system. In this particular case here, there was a company, this is a real story, there's a company that is in the chemical industry, and they have to purchase their chemicals, and they were working on a system to actually facilitate the chemical purchasing process for a lab in the organization. And so in this particular case, it turns out they were wasting a lot of money on their chemical expenses, and we'll dig into that a little bit more in a minute, but they had a reasonable goal. It wasn't huge, but they simply wanted over the course of 1 year to reduce their expenses in the chemical purchasing area from $1 million down to $750,000, okay, just over the course of 1 year. What I like about this example is it's really simple. Everybody can remember it. It's measurable, so I'll know if I got it or not. I'll know within 1 year, right? I worked on a project not so long ago, but where there were 2 different versions of software for 2 different types of customers within an organization. Like one piece of software is really focused on consumers, and the other one was more in like your business customers. And over the course of time, over the course of like 10, 15 years, these applications had grown and were both pretty major systems, yet 2 separate systems. However, the net of it is they basically did the same thing. So probably an 80% overlap in functionality, I would say. Now, the project that I was on, the stated objective was we need to combine 2 systems into one, right? So we had to use one as a baseline and then go find the gaps for the other and add those into the first one so that in the end we could retire that second system. But here's the thing, if you heard what I said, right, the objective or the outcome that they were striving for was to combine 2 systems into one. But that's not a business outcome at all. It may be a solution to a problem. It may be kind of an intermediate step along the way, but at the end of the day, the business never really cares whether they get their functionality in 2 systems or in 1 system, right? There's no real obvious dollar benefit associated with it the way that I stated, right? And so instead what we do with that team is we go back and look at well, what's the real cost of having two systems versus one, right? Is it actually holding us back in any kind of revenue growth? Or are we spending unnecessarily where we maybe could invest that money in additional growth somewhere else, right? So we had to break that problem down. I'm not saying the project was invalid. What I'm saying is we don't understand why it might actually be a good project and what the true value of it was going to be. All right, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the techniques here. So this is a model called the business outcomes model. You may also hear it called the business objectives model. It's the same format, same concepts. This is kind of what the full model looks like in template form, and I'll show it to you in an example in a moment here. But the essence here is you have what I would call like an iterative hierarchy process where you're going to move from left to right over and over, right? So on the very left, it's what are our top level problems? And then what are the top level outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And then below that, there's kind of a subset of problems. When we dig into a little bit more deeper, can we understand that subset of problems and what are the outcomes for those, which then ultimately leads us to what features do we need to build in our project. So let me walk you through an example here. All right, I'm just going to kind of walk you through this from left to right in this particular case. So at the very far left, we have a problem. Our sales team isn't selling enough products. So, okay, that's a problem. How would I know if I solved that problem? That's one of the questions that you would ask here. Well, the outcome that maps directly to that is I'm going to increase sales to $1 million. Okay, so that's an outcome that I am striving for with this project. I need to increase sales to $1 million. I haven't talked about features at all. I'm simply saying this is my goal. This is where I want to end up. So then we might ask some other questions and say, well, okay, what's keeping us from hitting $1 million today, right? What's underlying that actual problem? Why isn't sales selling enough? And that takes us to business problem number 2. And in this particular example, we found that the sales team simply didn't understand their products well enough. Okay, that makes sense. If they don't understand the products well, they're having a hard time selling them. So we can now set an outcome at that second level of problem, something a little bit more detailed than just increasing sales. Here we're going to actually set a training goal. So in this particular case, the goal was provide training to 100% of the sales team, thinking if we trained them, that would educate them, they would know the products, and they would be able to sell more. So now I'm at that lower level and I'm really starting to talk about solutioning when I say provide training, and from there I can start to talk about what features I may or may not want to build. So in this case we're proposing that we might want to build an online training system. We might want to do surveys to figure out did they actually understand the training that they just took, and then maybe we need to be able to download training so that the sales team, when they're on airplanes and whatnot, they can actually read the training. So this is, again, very simple example. Most projects that we work on are a little bit more complicated with this. You might see, the 2 layers of problems and outcomes, but you may see 3 or 4 different problems and outcomes in that when it gets a fully fleshed out model. And I will tell you, you may have heard me asking some questions of myself as I was walking you through that. And identifying those is actually quite hard. I don't mean to oversimplify it. I realize it's not a simple process to do this, to understand the outcomes. So I'm going to give you a couple suggestions here. First of all, you have to get with the right stakeholders for your project. Okay, that's the number one thing. This isn't just your peer, what do you guys think the problem is? It's not just asking your team. It's really understanding from the people who are funding the project or are going to get value out of the project, what is it that they want to receive? So we've got to talk to them. And that's the first thing. The thing you're going to do once you have them is you're going to just ask them why over and over again, right? Why are you building the product? Why do you care about solving a problem? Right? Keep asking that question until you can really come to some sort of a clear, defined problem that has some quantifiable dollar value behind it. And then we can turn those problems into outcomes. And I got to be honest with you, you're probably going to frustrate some people with this process. If you keep asking why over and over again, you might annoy them. So be ready to explain the value in the questions that you're asking, right? Help them understand why you're doing what you're doing. Don't just start asking why. This actually happened to me in a pretty, I would say, extreme case. I don't think it's usually this difficult, but I had called a meeting together. We had a new executive stakeholder in our project, and I called everybody together because I needed to understand what his outcomes were. What did he want out of this project? The project was already underway. I'd heard a rumor that he didn't like what we were building, but I hadn't talked to him. I didn't really know, and I felt like, okay, well, the team is building what the previous executive wanted. Maybe he has different goals. So I scheduled this meeting, and he walked into the room, and he says to me, what right do you have to ask what my business outcomes are? That's how he started the meeting, and I was a bit taken aback by it. But I kind of realized very quickly I just had to back off my questions and explain to him that, you know, why it was helpful for him if he helped me understand his outcomes, right? And so, you know, walking him through, and I basically in this particular case, I just said to him, look, we're building against these other outcomes. I told him what they were. I said, it sounds like you don't like what is being developed so far, but if you don't tell me what your outcomes are, we can't shift. We can't reprioritize towards them. So we're going to keep building the wrong product, and you're not going to get happier. And as soon as he understood it, he immediately, like, his personality softened, and he just started rattling off what his objectives, his outcomes were. So it's doable. You just got to be kind of 2 steps ahead of them in your conversation and what they might want to see. Now, experience have demonstrated for me that on most projects, you know, we start with something more like that far right side of that diagram that was the product concept and the features. Right? The point at which a project is underway, somebody has decided here's the solution, here's what we're going to build. So realistically, you can't go from left to right in that business outcomes model. Right, here's a classic example. You might have a project which is, I want to put a music player on the phone. And, you know, maybe they have a set of features already defined, like it needs to play music, it needs to store music, it needs to buy music, right? So that's great, but what I'm going to propose is that we actually still need to back up and understand why we're doing it, even if somebody thinks those are the right features, okay? And I have success metrics on there. My point of that is that sometimes you get a set of features and, oh, by the way, here's some success metrics like a launch date or a budget to stay within, but they're not really talking about the actual outcomes most commonly. So realistically, this isn't going to change. We're going to work on projects where somebody's already decided what we should build, okay? So keeping that in mind, that's all right. What we can do instead now is work back up from that product concept, from those features, to understand what problem is it that we need to actually solve, right? What problem does somebody think those features are going to solve for us? And we do this by asking, why is that a problem? Or why do I need that feature? And you do this continuously until you get yourself to the left with a really good, clear, defined business problem. And again, a good problem is much like a good outcome. It's got some hint of being related to finance, right? Increasing growth of revenue or decreasing costs, okay? So using that information, I will tell you, you can actually, once you understand the problems and outcomes, now you can develop a new product concept. And the catch is that that product may or may not be the same as the one that you walked in to hear about on day one, okay? And I get that that may be an uphill battle, but the idea here is that I now come in and I can say, okay, well, here's the actual problem, or here's the real outcome we're trying to achieve. I think that maybe the features have changed a little bit, and it's rare that it would completely change, right? Usually people have reasonable intuition about what to build, right? So now we're just helping make the business case for it and make sure that we don't need to maybe subtly tweak it, maybe add a feature, delete a feature, reprioritize within, that kind of thing, okay? So in my particular example that I showed you a minute ago, I'm going to go back to that, where we talked about the customer, they wanted to increase their sales, and their team didn't understand the products well. So in this particular case, the point that I came into the project or the program, the customer was insisting that they had to implement a full, what is called a learning management system for their customers, or an LMS you might have heard of, right? When I walked in, like, all I knew is sales team doesn't know what they're doing, we need an LMS so we can train them. And like, a learning management system is a pretty heavyweight solution and can be relatively expensive. So that's great, somebody had that idea, but when we started to back into, okay, well, why do they want this even? We understood that they cared only about a few things, and those were that they really wanted the system to make it easier for their sales reps to get training. Okay, so that would make it easier for them to sell more. They wanted it to be lightweight, simple, a sales rep could come in and get training. Second, they didn't want their sales reps to have to take training on how to take training. I know that sounds a little bit goofy, but some systems are so complicated that, you know, they basically have to it takes them half an hour even to get into the training. And then the third part is they wanted some way that they could incent their sales reps to actually take the training, right? And these 3 features, you can absolutely get those in a learning management system, no doubt. However, when we understood that those are the only outcomes they cared about, we could actually create a much simpler solution for them, something much more simple than a learning management solution. And instead, we came up with the features to build out a lightweight training system for them. So they custom developed something that was much simpler that achieved their needs. I'm going to take a quick pause here, and I'm going to ask the audience to participate a little. I know that's weird because we're in a webinar format, but I'd like to have you think about these questions on the screen here. And if you don't mind, maybe even just send me in the question box, or if you have a chat box, just go ahead and send some of your responses to this, right? Do you use business outcomes today? How do you use them? How are they used? Are you using them at the portfolio level, at the project? Do you prioritize with them? Do you have them and sit them on a shelf? Or now that third one's kind of interesting, hearing some of these ideas from today, how could you use them if you had them? All right, so just take a minute. I won't take too long here, but just type into the question box any responses you have, or again, you can use the chat box as well if you see that. Okay, good. So here's a couple answers here. It looks like, yep, there we go. We have a few people who are saying they don't use them. They don't really have anything quite like that today. Lots of people are saying that, actually. Okay, so this is cool. So this is good information. So here's someone who they do them, but they find them really hard to quantify. Great. Okay, here we go. This is here's one. We use them, and they're mostly at the project level. Right. There's another one. We don't have monetary associations. That's like the other ones. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Here's another one. We use them on projects, but we don't use them to organize which projects to do or not. Okay, good. So it sounds like we have some people doing business outcomes. That's outstanding. That makes me happy. And maybe there's some things we can do to either improve them by making them measurable, or improve how we use them. And I get that kind of depends on you as an individual's role in the organization. But the idea is, I don't see too many people responding that they use them to select projects, and so that might be a key thing to think about whether you can change in your organization. All right, let's move on. All right, so I put the slide up before, right? I mentioned that we can absolutely do these at the portfolio level, and then we can also do them at the project level. So I'd like to talk about that second part. How do we use them to select the features that we want to do on the projects? So I talked a little bit about projects, but I want to dive a bit more into features because I think so many people live in that world that their project's funded, but now they need to prioritize, right? All right, so this is a model that I'm going to walk you through, and then I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because I think that this is a relatively, what I would call maybe trickier model to grasp. Once you get into it, it's not so bad, but I want to make sure everybody feels comfortable with it. So again, it's called an objective chain. The whole model as a whole is called this, all right? And the idea behind it is that we're going to link the value of our features to our business outcomes. Okay, we're going to go through an example. So again, just bear with me for 1 minute here as I walk you through the concept. Now remember, the goal here is that I want to cut features that least significantly contribute to my business outcomes. Okay, and I'm going to tell you that using this technique, we have used this to cut up to 80% of the requested features and still delivered the business value. That's huge. Now, not every project can cut 80%, but could you get to the 65% or even 30%? That could be big, right? Okay, so with the small at the top, we have on the far left our business outcome. That's the same outcome we've been talking about so far today. And at the bottom on the right, we have our features. In the middle, linking them, we have what we would call outcome factor or objective factors. These are statements of how the feature contributes to the business outcome, all right? Each factor here, so again, those blue long rectangles in the middle, they're going to have an equation on it, and when we use data in that equation, we can actually come up with a dollar value for the feature set at the far right. And by the way, when I say you have to have data, okay, that data could come from your existing products. It could be something you have in place today that you have been able to measure historically, or it could come from industry standards around how something should perform. Or you might make it up, and by make it up, I mean take a stab at a reasonable estimate of what you think how you think you might quantify something, right? And this gets into another whole area. You may have to make some assumptions to make this model work. I would say the key is to document those assumptions in case they ever prove not to be true. Then you come back and you course correct. And again, I'm going to remind you, intuition about this stuff is usually pretty good. So I'm not saying ignore that. And in that intuition, don't worry about, use your intuition when you have to. These don't have to be precise calculations. What I'm looking for here is like an order of magnitude, so that when I have like a vice president saying, I have to have this, wish list functionality in my shopping cart. I have to have it. You have to build it. Well, then we can put it into this model and look and see whether the numbers actually say that I have to have it. Is it truly that important or not? Okay, let's dive into the example. And feel free, if you have a question about it, don't hesitate. You can put that in the chat bar. And also, you will get my email at the end if you have questions you want to follow up with offline. Happy to help, because I know this is a bit of a complicated model to digest. All right. Okay, so here's our example. We're still in that online training example world, right? And if you recall, our goal was to increase our sales revenue. We wanted to increase it by $1 million, right? Now, we can think about the concept of building training and why it's important. I think we all kind of understand that. Again, our gut says, yeah, training seems reasonable. So we figured out that if people take training, then they pass these tests that the team had in place. So then we have to think about, well, why is passing tests a good thing? And when we do that, we realize that passing more tests means that they know their products better and they sell more. Okay, so all I've done right there, it's stating some pretty obvious things here, but what I'm saying is that building training can actually help us sell more, right? So if I increase it, and that's kind of what I'm doing, is walking from right to left up the stair step here, talking about if I provide online training, more reps take the training. Okay, providing training options outside the classroom increases participation. If people participate in training, they pass tests. If they pass tests, then they sell more. And now I am achieving my outcome in some form or fashion. Okay, so training is important. This is the online aspect of it. Now, I'm going to actually put up on the screen a couple pieces of data that are assumptions built into my model. You would, figure out for you the same kind of thing. But in this particular case, there's 1,000 sales reps, and typically about 600 of them would attend training. So what we're proposing is if we could put that training online, okay, this is a new feature, the forecasts indicate that we could probably get as many as 900 people in that additional training, okay? So that's an additional 30% of sales reps who actually are taking training. Historical data has also revealed that completing the training prior to taking the test increases that pass rate from 25 to 90%. Again, more people, the number of, and I can tell you the number of sales reps here that would pass moves from, and I have this jotted down, 640 to 835 people are now actually passing tests. All right, so we keep going. So again, 90% of 900 sales reps who take training, plus the 25% who don't, who could pass it anyway. That's how I got to that number. Moreover, because people who pass the test an average of 20% more in revenue, the revenue is going to increase as well. So $39,000 increase in sales based on that, and that's per day. Okay, so each of the 195 sales reps passing the test creates that additional revenue per day. All right, and so that's kind of what this figure is trying to show you. Now, I'm going to take a different feature and walk you through it. So keep in mind for a minute, what I'm showing here is a $39,000 value on that online training. Someone else had come along and said, hey, can we have download training? Like, my sales reps are on the plane all the time. I feel like they would take the training when they were on the plane, and they don't have time to download and sit at their desk and take the training. So, okay, that sounds reasonable, right? Well, in this particular case, a lot of the objective training is still the same. If we can get them to take training, we know that there's value. So the goal is all about that lower box, that lower right side blue box. How many people will take training if it's downloadable that would not have taken it if it was online? And the answer is not very many. We actually went out and surveyed and figured out about 2% increase is what we were going to see if we provided downloadable training. So when I take that and do the math all the way up the chain like I just did, I end up with a feature value of about $2,600 a day. Right? So here they are side by side. One of our features is a $39,000 feature a day, and the other one is $2,600 a day. And over the course of a year, I'm trying to get to $1 million in value. So if you do kind of just even without calculating it yourself, you can very quickly see one of these features is high value and one is actually quite minimal value. So in this particular case, we actually decided that the right answer was for them to cut the download training and only focus on building online training for their reps in terms of how they provided the training. All right, so that's kind of a quick example of it. I will also tell you, in going through this process, we uncovered a couple different assumptions, and when I said you need to track those, this is what I'm talking about. At some level, you're assuming that if you build online training, people will come take it. Built into that assumption is, how do they even know about it? Do the reps, do they know that this is an option? Well, not necessarily. There's a whole different team working beside us on how do we market this training to the sales reps, right? I can't take it for granted that if I build it, they will just come use it. That's my point. So be thinking about other things, maybe assumptions you're making, and making sure that those are actually held true. Here's a bit of a slide example of what I started to refer to at the very beginning of the presentation. In this particular case, one of our customers was adding functionality to their call center application. That project had three kind of main features. These are top-level features. One was that they wanted the sales rep to be able to edit a customer shopping cart that the customer built online. So the customer would go to their website, build a shopping cart, make a phone call. Okay, so they wanted the sales rep to be able to edit that customer shopping cart. And then another, and to actually place the order for them. Sorry, that was a key part of that one. The sales rep would be able to place the order. Another was to be able to push those edits back to the customer. So I, as a sales rep, just changed something in your cart. I want to push it back so you, customer, can go online and see that cart yourself now. All right. The third one, the third feature was I want to allow the customer to see real-time edits that are made by the rep. Okay, so as they're adding items to my cart or taking them out, I'm seeing the changes on my screen from my own computer. Okay. What's interesting is this project had a $14 million return. They built these features, they believed they would get a $14 million return. The catch was, to get it, they had to launch it before their holiday season. They have a huge retail business that takes off during the holiday season, and to captivate on the value of this project, they had to launch it by that holiday season. We came in with, kind of early in the requirements work, and it became very clear the development team was on path to building a really massive system that would do all three of these things, but had no chance of hitting the deadline. That meant we were pretty confident they were on track to deliver exactly $0 in return. So we prioritized the features in this case, and we showed that if they simply did the feature that had the rep edit the cart and complete the sale for them, okay, so the rep is the one who's taking that middle rep is going to edit the cart and they're going to complete the sale while they have the customer on the phone. They would actually get a $12 million return out of that. And if we were pretty confident we could do that part at least by the holiday season. Now, our customer really wanted to try and do all of it, and we showed them that, realistically you're probably not going to be able to do it, and by the way, those other two features don't add all that much contribution to the $14 million. The good news is, while they wanted to do it all, they were at least willing to prioritize the order in which they worked on things. So they focused all their resources on building that middle of this diagram, right, where the rep edits the cart and completes the sale. And they deprioritized the other two features to do them later. And I will tell you that development team worked around the clock. There were literally no more hours that they could have worked. And they did get it done, but all they got done was the middle part. That was the reps could edit the cart and complete the sale. What's really interesting to me, so this is actually, I get that they never got their $14 million return, but they did get $12 million return, which is much bigger than the $0 that they were on track towards. So we would call this a win. I think any organization would probably call $12 million a win. And to really demonstrate the point, fast forward a few years, they never went back to even build the other two features. Right? Because now you're looking at, ooh, do I really want to take on this $2 million feature? No, not necessarily, because there's probably another $10 million project out there. All right, I want to switch focus here and talk about metrics before we run out of time. So based on, there we go. Based on some research we did around metrics and how do we measure ROI, we found that CIOs in particular, these are the core things that they care about. In fact, even higher than CIOs, you'll find this. Executives are really trying to make sure that the IT work they're doing is aligned to the business. Second thing, the work that they work on, they want to shift their budgets to things that add the most value. This is really important because it's now less about, do I deliver projects to fix what I have out there or to cut costs? They're really trying to more do projects that increase revenue. And the third one is that we're seeing that they want to decrease their time to market. And this is really where you see such a huge push towards the agile space right now, is to try and decrease that time to market. Okay, so knowing that ITs care about these things, we can come up with metrics that align to those things. All right, and all I'm going to do present here for you is just a couple different examples of things you can measure. Your organization may have a different twist on any of these or something completely different, and that's okay. These are simply ideas. So if I want to measure increasing business alignment, number one thing I can do is measure the business value delivered, right? So the business says, this is what I want, this is the outcome I want, and at the end I'm going to measure, did we deliver it or not? What % of projects did we deliver it on? Or what % of value have we delivered over the course of a year? Another metric you could look at is adoption, end user adoption. So if you're trying to align to the business, then you can measure that by knowing, did the business adopt the solution that you built? I don't like it as much, but it's something that could work in addition maybe to the one above it. All right, on the second category, IT budget is going to shift to those things that add the most value. So on this particular case, we can measure again what portion of the expected value is delivered by IT. Right? How much are they, if they signed up to deliver $14 million, did they deliver 14, did they deliver 12, or did they deliver 0? Right? And again, you can do that as percentages or not, just depending how you collect the data. And then another thing we can look at, kind of more interim metric, is how many projects are we able to cut and how many features are we able to cut from within projects. We have some interesting results around that. When you focus on cutting scope, you can actually cut pretty significant scope. All right, decreasing time to market, we can measure how frequently we release actual product to users. We can also look at how much we spend on rework, right? So you would expect to spend less on that and get things, if you spend less on that, sorry, then you can expect you're delivering the product faster. You're doing less work over and over again. Now, one thing that's important to remember about defining business value and business outcomes is that business value is something that doesn't come until after you've actually delivered a solution. All right, so this is important only because, you know, if you have this goal to sell $1 million or to increase sales by $1 million over the course of 1 year, that's great, but you can't actually measure that until the project is done and a year has passed, right? For this reason, I will tell you that I really like to set interim metrics that tell me, am I on track to deliver or not? Okay, and so here's some examples of those, right? I might measure, not only later am I going to measure, did I achieve my business outcome, do I even have them defined? That is something I can measure within a couple weeks of starting a project. And I can look over across all of my projects to see, do we have them defined? And then as projects are launched, are we even measuring them? So that's kind of an interim step towards, am I delivering the outcome? Am I even able to measure whether I delivered the outcome? A lot of times you have to actually build features in to your system so that you can measure the outcome later. So, you know, that's something to maybe think about early on, and then figure out, can I actually measure it even if I failed to achieve it? Other things you can measure are how many features did I cut, what % of projects are actually late, and that gets to time to market, right? How often are we set a target and then we miss it? And then the % of projects are using those outcomes every day. And so this is key, right? We don't define these outcomes simply to say, here's what we're trying to do, and then did I deliver them? Throughout the entire duration of my projects, I need to be revisiting those outcomes over and over again to make sure I'm prioritizing the features that will most likely deliver those outcomes. I have a couple things I'm going to just show you real quickly here in terms of some research that we did, some surveys, and exploring some of our own projects. What I found here, this is one where we went out to figure out how many people are actually measuring the benefit that they're getting or measuring the outcomes, and how many know what the outcomes are well enough that they could actually use them to prioritize features here. And so I would say there's a mix as to whether projects know what the outcomes are or aren't, right? So that's not so surprising, But typically, even when they do have them, I find that you kind of see towards the left of that chart, more often than not, they're not really defined well enough that they could be used to prioritize things. So they have some vague idea of the outcomes, but they're maybe not crisp enough to be used in prioritization. Here's another one here, right? This first grouping tells us that in general, the business does think about business outcomes. That's how they select projects. So that's cool, right? That's our portfolio selection. The middle grouping tells us that they're really picking the ones that have the most benefit. I like that. That's good. But the third one tells us that once they know the project is selected, they don't necessarily use those outcomes anymore to do the prioritization with their projects. So that's a lot of what I'm talking about today, is you don't just shelve them once your project's funded. You use them to make your decisions. Something that we did here internally with our projects is start to measure whether we have success statements defined. Again, those are kind of like your business outcome statements. And then the second measure there is, do we use them every day to prioritize the work we're working on every single day? And so I started to track these about a year ago. I will tell you almost every project has a really good success statement. I love that. But we are not always using them. And we live and breathe this stuff, so it's hard, I get that. The goal in that second metric is to get that closer to 100%. This is a quick chart that shows you what happens when you focus on cutting unnecessary scope. We found that an experienced BA can actually cut 80% of features, even more sometimes, when that is what they're focused on doing. Cut the stuff that doesn't bring you business value. Prioritize the stuff that does bring value. So this is just an example of 6 different projects that we looked at. The first 2 projects on the left, we actually came in to do analysis after the projects were done. And I will tell you, generally, the typical person could, without really trying, cut somewhere in that order of 15 to 20% of scope. So that's pretty normal. What we're doing is trying to push that a little bit further to cut even more unnecessary scope with a focus on that. Okay, so why don't you have business outcomes? That's something to think about here. If we agree that they're important, then why don't more of our projects have them? And you, again, you're welcome to contribute over in the chat box or question box if you want to send me kind of why don't you think you have them today. I'm going to share with you kind of some common things that I have seen. Number one is confusion about what they are. All right, so this is more that maybe the business doesn't really know what they're trying to get to. Or maybe the analysts on the team or the product managers don't really understand what business outcomes are in order to define them, or they don't know how to, write good ones. The second thing, and this is a pretty interesting one, management won't tell us, right? They think they've come up with them, they've said the project's a go, and they don't think it's our business to know them, right? Those of us who are actually on the ground every day. And so that's a problem. So again, remember, we need to just educate them about why they're important for us to do in terms of this prioritization of projects and prioritization of features is kind of the where you go with the data on that. The third one is, this is a tricky one. Stakeholders don't want to be measured. So this can be a problem where you have your executives who are saying here's the desired outcome, but they don't want to be held accountable if they miss. And so they don't want to put them on paper. That's a really big hot topic, right? That can get really political pretty fast. Ideally, you try and shift your culture where it's okay if we fail as long as we knew what we were trying to do. But I get that that is very, very hard. The fourth one is that stakeholders don't actually even agree on the outcome sometimes. You may have 2 different business executives that you're working with and they want different things. And so we would need to get the right people in the room to negotiate through that and figure out, okay, where is their common ground, and really actively try and do that. And if there's not, who gets say so? Who has authority to decide which outcome is more important? All right. So all I'm trying to say here is that there's going to be some challenges. I understand that, right? I want you to be ready for them. One of the things to know about it, I've mentioned that the value isn't really measured until the project's over. So do what you can to measure as you go. No, right, that team could disband. You may not even be able to get to the people there. So do everything you can to put systems in place to measure after the project's over. All right, so plan ahead for how you're going to measure it later. Number 2, you know what, sometimes the data doesn't exist and you have got to be able to measure the stuff that doesn't exist today. So if today you don't have data, at least put something in place so that you can measure it in the future. So you're going to build the features to allow you to do this next time. And finally, this is the big one that I just mentioned, that people don't want to be held accountable for their actual results. So you're going to have to very carefully, politically sometimes, maneuver that. Okay, just to wrap up here real quick, I promised I feel like you can take something away and use it on your project tomorrow or even today. And so here's what I'm going to suggest to you, just to kind of boil down what we've talked about. Number one, identify the business outcomes for your project. If no one else is doing it, at least you yourself should do it, okay? Then try to get your team on board with that. Right? So think about what you're working on today. What's the point of it? What's the value of it? It could be small or big, it doesn't matter. Now, if you're in a position where you're able to make project decisions or portfolio decisions, then I'd like you to actually start cutting the minimal value projects. Literally figure out, is there a project today that isn't of value and could get cut? And don't worry about somebody's, you know, oh, what are they going to go work on, right? If you bring that skill set, then all you're doing is shifting resources to the most valuable projects, and you yourself will be seen as a leader for doing it. But on the second path at the bottom, once I understand what my outcomes are in my given project, within a project, I want you to figure out, can you cut any minimum valuable features out of your project scope? Okay? Next, literally try and trace your requirements back to your outcomes. Right? It could be the feature level, it could be the requirement level, but individually, can you say how your requirements support the outcomes? And if you can't, you should question whether you need those requirements or not. And if nothing else, just try and pick one metric. I gave you some here today. Pick one and measure it, right? You can just start there. You don't have to do everything, right? But all of this, what we're trying to do is deliver those business outcomes. And so these are just kind of steps along the way that'll at least inch us in that. Okay, with that, I'm going to point you, here's a couple different resources. I know I'm totally biased about some of these books that I got in this grade. I love them, but if you have questions or any comments or thoughts on them, please feel free to reach out. But the first one, Visual Models, is going to explain that business outcomes model and then the objective chain in a lot more depth. The second one talks in particular about outcomes and objectives. That's more of a general requirements book. And then if you really do want to dive a little bit deeper, in particular to understand the objectives chains, you can grab this white paper off of our website. It's got kind of what I've done today in the webinar, but in a little bit more detail and something that you kind of reference more simply. So again, those are potential useful resources if you want to learn a bit more. And as promised, I put my contact information up here. Do not hesitate to reach out to me with questions or thoughts. I always welcome the outreach, and my email up there at the top is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. All right, with that signed, a few minutes, do you have any questions coming in that we want to address?
Yeah, we do, Joy, and while I give you a little bit of a pause where you could get some water and perhaps take a breath, we do have a couple of questions. The first one is, how do the concepts here apply in an agile or safe environment?
Okay, really good example. I didn't talk too much about methodology today, I guess. Or sorry, good question, not example. I do know that I mentioned a couple times how you might use these, but here's the thing I'll say, just at a general level, that the concept of defining business outcomes, the models that I used here, the objective change, the business outcomes model, are really going to be applicable in any approach that you use, be it waterfall, agile, or something else in the spectrum. Now, you might define them and use them at different points in the project, right? For example, objective chains, right? That's where we put the dollar value on the features. That's something in Agile that you could literally continuously update that and use it to prioritize your backlog all along the way. The other thing I'll say, and this gets particularly into the safe question, part of the question, you can use these outcomes at different levels in different ways, right? Be it a portfolio level, program level, or maybe just at the team level. So at portfolio, you're really going to use them to figure out which projects to take on or not. And then at a program level, you might use them to align priorities across the team, or the teams, sorry. And then at that team level, that lowest level, these are really the basis for what you build and when you build it. So I hope that answered that question.
Thank you, Joy. A couple other questions. We have about a minute and a half or so left.
Okay.
Question is, what if I can't uncover outcomes that are related to dollars?
Yeah, that's a frequent problem. I mean, we've been doing this for years, and we see that all the time. So if you don't have business outcomes at all, not even the non-measurable ones, I place odds that your project's at high risk to be canceled. So try and get some kind of outcome on paper Because here's the thing, if it's not crystal clear why a project's happening, somebody's going to come along, question it, and probably determine the value isn't there if we can't say it. In fact, we've recommended people put projects on hold if they don't know the outcomes that they want out of them. Now, if you have them but they're not measurable, which I think sounds like the question that's being asked here, really you're in a better spot, at least admittedly. You can at least try to prioritize based on how you think that they would be quantified. The issue here is you may just not have enough business justification for the cost there. So worst case, if you can't quantify them, particularly in terms of dollars, try and find some kind of reasonable proxy that your stakeholders could get on board with to prioritize them.
We have time for one more question, somewhat
Sure.
related to the last one. What if my business partners won't share outcomes with me?
Yeah, okay, yeah. And I touched on this really quickly. So here's the thing. At the end of the day, you need to educate them on why are you asking for this information. They might think you're poking your nose in their business kind of unnecessarily. They may feel invaded. They may feel threatened. I get all of that. But that said, they might be very willing to help you if they understood why you were doing it. So that's imperative that, you know, it's imperative that they understand that if you don't understand what the expected outcomes are, then there's almost no chance you could actually build a solution that delivers them. It's really as simple as that. And so you need to help them understand that. And you could do it by saying that, or you could do it potentially by telling them stories of, we had this project where we didn't know the outcomes, and here's what happened, the catastrophe that followed, right? So those are kind of personalized stories that you may be able to pull in there. I see there's some other questions coming in, and I know we're out of time, Simon, but maybe people can just shoot me an email if there's another one.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you so much, Joy. That hour really flew by. For those listening, if you do have questions that we did not get to, Joy's email is at the top of this last slide. But thank you all for joining today's C-Level webinar. Appreciate you investing an hour of your time. If you have any questions, please email Joy. But otherwise, have a good day.